Hello, welcome back to Hobby News Daily. I am still Danny Black, but today I'm joined by Ryan from GEMRATE, and very topical right now because in the tweet that shook the hobby, Darren Ravel quoted GEMRATE data. So we want to talk to Ryan about the sale and about everything related to this. Luckily, you agreed to sit down and let me harass you. How you doing, Ryan?
Thank Good, Danny. Thanks for having me. The funny thing about that Ravel tweet is that people initially thought that I sourced the deal the way that he tweeted it. But I was like, nope, just the market share guy. That's all. Nothing. I have no insight into this deal whatsoever. But it definitely gave me some additional followers, so I didn't mind the way it was positioned. But yes, that was a fun and interesting evening.
It is interesting to me that the data you've come up with is now used as kind of standard market share. Um, I wonder, before you were doing this, do you have any idea? Was it just guessing and public records on how these companies were doing?
Yeah, I don't think there was a lot published. I mean, there wasn't. I mean, that's one of the reasons I was excited to bring this to market. Is there really wasn't much activity and sort of people that were zooming out. It was hard data to come by, and the only way you could really do it was sort of evaluating the pop reports, or the companies were volunteering it, and it was pretty closely guarded information for a long time with the outside of PSA, which is a public company, so it wasn't really readily available. So it's been interesting to start to sort of window that, and then just now I've got 3 years of a track record of bringing this to market, so it's nice to have some time series data as well with it.
Well, I thought it was very cool to see uh, the breakdown of the pie that Darren showed, and I think it was 75% for PSA. Am I correct on that?
I'm actually confirming that myself here.
Roughly.
Um, let's see. Yeah, so the official numbers were 78% for PSA. This is 2023, by the way. 78% PSA, 4% Beckett, 10 sorry, I should do it in order. 78% PSA, 10% CGC, 7% SGC, and 4% Beckett.
One of the things I want to hit on that I think nobody's talking about is the amount of TCG that's involved in the grading business and the hobby. Do you
Yep,
have a
yep.
sense of how large that is compared to sports cards?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but I mean, it was almost 40% of the cards that were graded, I think, last year. So it was massive. And, if you actually only looked at PSA sports business last year, it was actually down single digit percent. And so,
Really?
it's really perceived to be, thriving in a lot of ways, and grading's doing well. But TCG was almost all the incremental growth across the industry, with the exception of SGC, which is probably a large part why SGC was an attractive asset, is that they're primarily sports, and they were one of the only companies really growing from a pure sports standpoint.
I did not realize that PSA Sports had gone down slightly.
Yeah, yeah.
And SGC does almost nothing in trading card games.
Yeah, I mean, they're starting to sort of become a little bit more interesting in that sense, but it's still pretty insignificant for them. I mean, I'm looking at the numbers for February that I'm going to release in a few hours, and it's still around 20,000 a month, which is pretty much not much for them, not much relative to a lot of the larger players in the industry. So it's really small.
All right, so let's go back. Um, how does this actually work? You are contacted, you provide this data, but you don't know what's going on. Is that
Oh, yeah, no, I had no insight
the night
whatsoever.
of the
I was
tweet?
this
I'm
was
sorry, the night of the tweet.
Yeah, no, it was. It's interesting because I mean, I try to keep a pretty good pulse of everything that's going on, and I do have good conversations with a lot of the companies in the space. But this was completely off my board as it relates to just like things that could happen in the near term here. It's very interesting, and so yeah, I had no insight into this, no real. I was not many people were speculating this. I think a couple of years ago when SGC was starting to gain some momentum and they were smaller, there was sort of a thought that PSA could acquire them or collectors could acquire them as sort of a smaller tuck in. But as SGC gained a lot of momentum, I think it was much less of a, consideration. So it's very interesting for sure. And I think a lot of people, obviously, you've seen, there's been a lot of people speaking on this recently and just sort of weighing in. I think a lot of people thought Fanatics was definitely like in the picture, but not necessarily collectors. So it's definitely caught a lot of people off guard, which is fun. I mean, that's kind of what, why so many people are talking about it, is it wasn't on the radar of most.
The rumors I had heard a while ago were Fanatics and even CGC.
Yeah.
But it caught us all off guard. So what was your initial reaction when you found out?
Definitely surprised. I definitely thought it would be Fanatics, picking up, SGC in that sense. Or honestly, I thought more like the scenario would have been Fanatics really getting aggressive prior to going public here and making a bid for collectors or something like that,
Yeah.
which is obviously like a massive play. And, but that was just something more that I had been floated or at least like considered or contemplated versus just this, PSA SGC or collectors SGC lockup. So I was just surprised. It was definitely a good exercise to think about why though. One, like, why is collectors making the move? But two, why, if Fanatics was in the mix, why did they back out? Or sort of why was it not compelling enough for them to move forward? So just interesting to sort of play through different scenarios.
For me, it's fascinating. And I talked to Nat Turner on, I guess it was 2 days ago now, and he is adamant they're staying two different companies for the foreseeable future. And they're going to share some technology and some stuff like that, but they're staying two different companies.
Yep.
For the purpose of market share and business, let's put them under the same umbrella. Collectors now controls what percent of the grading in the hobby?
Roughly 85%.
85% through collect. I mean, that's unbelievable.
Yeah, no, it's a ton. And one of the things that's interesting, obviously, is people are talking about, competition, monopolies, antitrust, all these things. Is this is a bit of a recent phenomenon. So the case that if you're like a PSA slash collectors, you could make is that this has only been like a 1 to 2 year trend, and like Beckett was a much larger player up until recently. They just really have stumbled. Um, I mean, in total, over their history, SGC is still a smaller company than Beckett as it relates to like total volume they've done, total revenue they've done. So it's interesting, but yes, as of right now, sort of where things stand, 85% share, which is massive, obviously, but um, that's not always been the case, obviously. So it's going to be interesting to hear sort of more about just like does this raise any flags?
From a collector standpoint, and this has nothing to do with your professional work, do you think this changes the price of SGC slabs?
Mm, no, not in the near term. I think that's something people want to believe. People are trying. SGC has done a great job building
Everybody
a.
with SGC slab wants to believe it.
Yeah, I mean, look, people want to will it, right? I mean, people want Beckett to succeed. People want SGC to succeed. People want CGC to succeed, right? There's definitely like a desire for there to be options, and ultimately, PSA does dictate a lot of what happens in this market, and I think people want there to be options, and people want SGC to be, you know, considered to be, worthy of pricing that's similar in secondary market to what PSA, demands. Ultimately, obviously, that's not currently the case unless it's vintage we're talking about. And so, I don't know. I don't think it changes in the near term. I think you'll hear a lot of people sort of hoping that's the outcome, but I don't know that it really does factor in the near term or the medium term. Candidly,
One of the things I find fascinating, and I believe I'm correct on this, is the three most expensive cards ever sold were all SGC graded. Um,
Mhm.
and you talked about vintage and their strength there. I wonder if that perception, for the really high end pre-war, early vintage, add some cachet to the PSA, vintage line. They could make that a premium vintage kind of niche, company.
Yeah.
Um, just from a common business standpoint, it would seem odd to run two identical companies simultaneously.
Yeah, I mean, if I sort of, just sort of reverse engineer what might have happened here. Look, if you go through the scenario that Fanatics is interested, but collectors made a play and they're like, we'll figure it out, but we can't, have this sort of risk of value destruction, and we'll sort of, you know, hopefully make this accretive to us, but at least prevent and block, there being a more aggressive play and a more realistic and larger competitor in the market, with you know, significant backing. Um, and if you think about sort of what PSA could do with that, the one part of the market that I feel like has been neglected throughout the strength that PSA has demonstrated over the last few years is they're a real strong base. The sec collector, the vintage collector, really
Yep.
feels like they've been overlooked the last few years, and you hear a lot about that, and it's part of why SGC has sort of picked up some momentum with the vintage collector is that PSA's overlooked them in a lot of ways. And so, to the degree that they can, strengthen, the vintage collector or sort of their perception with the vintage collector, I think that's a win for them. And so, it's certainly a bet if that's the case. Again, I'm sort of playing out this scenario that it was not necessarily an offensive move, but maybe more of a defensive move with potential for it to be productive. There's definitely an angle where vintage benefits significantly from this in a lot of ways. And I don't know exactly what that means, but that's why I do think, outside of the fact that you have to hear this language that they're not going to be folded in, um,
Yeah.
they probably don't know, candidly, to some degree, what this looks like. And I think they want to sort of understand a little bit more like how it could look like if this was a little bit more of a portfolio strategy from collectors, and if SGC really did just double down on vintage and some of their strengths. But to the thing you mentioned early on when we first were introducing this is that, there's a ton that PSA has done since they went private, and a lot of that SGC is not that different in scale from where PSA was 4 years ago. PSA, when they went private, was roughly 25, 30 million in revenue
Say
from a.
that again, because I think that's an important point.
Yeah. So when PSA, prior to the pandemic, when they were a public company, they were doing on the sports card side and autograph side, they were doing 25, 30 million in revenue. They had the coin business as well. But it was fairly, similar to what SGC is now. If you back into sort of SGC's grading volume and sort of what they are charging per card, they're roughly a $25 million revenue company as well, versus where PSA was 4 or 5 years ago, right? And so if you think about what PSA might be thinking about, they can apply a lot of that same playbook to where they were 4 or 5 years ago and apply that to SGC in a lot of ways, without having to, create everything from scratch too. They can sort of take that playbook and leverage a lot of the technology, which is a lot of things that they had to, really build from the ground up. They went from being a really sort of old school value public company that was really a dividend paying company where they didn't want to break things and they just wanted to be the largest, fish in a small pond, to a company that really had pretty big ambitions to be much larger and sort of a category grower. And so I definitely think, there's a lot they learned in that process, and they can apply a lot of that to SGC.
I think that's a great point. It reminds me of like a baseball free agent between the Yankees and the Red Sox. You got to sign them just so your competitor doesn't, and then you'll figure out where they bat in the lineup later.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
yeah, no,
totally.
that's a great perspective on it. The defensive move now, and this is my opinion. Um, I've put this out in Hobby News Daily, so I'll say I've heard and sourced that Golden is going to be sold. Um,
Hmm.
I think when you look at Golden going out, SGC coming in, clearly there's a corporate um, cleanup, to some degree, and I just think it's fascinating that they're doubling down on the grading side.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it really, they could have doubled down on the auction side. They could have done a lot of different things. But I wonder if this is now going to really get the vaulting, the technology, if they can focus more on the grading now that they have invested more into that.
Yeah, I mean I think that's the hard call if you're collectors, and that's been the call they've probably been struggling with for 2 years after they raised money and sort of at a pretty significant valuation, which is again like we're not just going to be this sort of narrowly focused grader, but we have ambitions to be larger again and sort of really participate in many different ways. I think they probably found out that it's just hard to do, especially when a category sort of was peaking as they were sort of raising as many were, and sort of was sort of contracting in a lot of ways, and sort of thinking about what are our strengths and let's not overlook sort of like what got us here. And so it not a surprise if sort of this golden thing does come to fruition. And I do think, yeah, leaning into their strengths and sort of like really solidifying the base is probably not the worst thing for them to do. And definitely it becomes a little bit less of like a growth story but more of like an operation story in some ways. Like margins and stuff like that could be really attractive. It's one of the reasons why like maintaining pricing is going to be really important for them. And again, sort of like consuming SGC can help them sort of maintain margins and sort of not have everything move to the lowest price offering in the market, where $9 becomes where that's where they were. If you look at their SEC filings from 5 years ago, it was $9 a card, right? And that's not where
It's
they want to go.
unbelievable.
No, it's crazy, right? And that's why, it's interesting to think about. They were doing 3 million a year in cards graded back 4 or 5 years ago at $9 a card. And SGC got to that same number doing 1.2 million at 15 to $17 a card or something like that. So anyways, it's definitely interesting to think about, and I definitely think that's probably the hard call they've had to make, which was, instead of being, similar to what Fanatics is trying to do in a lot of ways, which is playing uh, in a lot of different pools. They're just trying to, be the lead grader in a lot of different ways, potentially being a little bit more horizontal when they think about categories they can participate in, similar to like the Funko move that they made, and maybe doing more of that stuff, in the future.
I'm still not a Funko believer, but best of luck.
Yeah, you don't hear much about that. So I mean, that's another thing that's interesting because it's I don't know. Obviously, that was an experiment, and you don't hear a lot about it, and it's maybe one that they're not feeling the best about. But I definitely think it's like, okay, let's just stick to sort of our strengths and sort of slowly expand.
Well, and you made the comment, and I completely agree. Is they're lean into your strength. And by having SGC and another grading company, they can focus on their strength. I think personally, the Golden Purchase originally, I think they might have paid too much, and it wasn't their strength. It wasn't their wheelhouse. Um, but it was a hot market at the time.
Totally different market. You could totally understand what they were trying to accomplish there. I can't even remember yet if Fanatics was even sort of, there were whispers or Fanatics had even, you know, sort of encroached, the market at that time. But yeah, I mean, it's very different. I mean, look, ultimately, the thing that I think about that's really interesting, I have, I'm trying not to sort of bring up the same things that I've heard, other people talk about at this stage related to this transaction. But like, the reality is collectors is downstream of Fanatics. Fanatics controls the production, and that's a really powerful place to be in. And so, if SGC would have landed with Fanatics, that would have been a real challenge with just sort of securing cards from a grading standpoint. And in this way, they really do sort of like control a lot of the grading momentum and a lot of that conversation, and become potentially more of a partner to Fanatics for somebody that's competing with Fanatics. And if they have Golden and all these things too, that just sort of like pits them against Fanatics and another on another frontier. And in this way, maybe there's potential for them to sort of be complementary in a lot of ways, and maybe hopefully seek to grow the hobby together as opposed to in opposition. But ultimately, Fanatics is driving a lot of this. They have the licenses, they produce the cards, they control a lot of the relationships, and so if you're collectors, you're sort of doing whatever you can to sort of like really hold on to your strengths here. And obviously, this is a play to do some of that.
uh, I think the disparity in the size of the companies is a good point. I think in the hobby we have this narrow focus, but Fanatics is so much larger than Collectors as a holding company.
Yeah, I mean, even from like a pure revenue standpoint, I think if you sort of look at what both publicly Panini and Fanatics slash Tops have said, it's like 1.5 billion in trading card revenue. That's just SRP, I think, or just like roughly that over the last year. Versus the grading revenue is a few hundred million, and so it's just a very different scale of conversation and sort of activity in the market and participation as it relates to trading cards in general.
A couple things that I want to point out. I think Fanatics is smart enough to know that certain slabs have better value on the secondary market, and they can't put out a brand that won't sell and hurt their image. They
Hmm.
already, if you go to some of their stores, they actually have their own slab, but they don't grade the card. It's in a essentially a regular slab, but the label is just more of a product label. It's not a graded. So they have the technology. I mean, it's there.
Right,
But I think they know that if it goes to market, the secondary value would be much less.
right.
Um, do you agree that PSA that's one of their advantages is that secondary market value is still going to be strongest for them?
I do, but I think one of the things that's not really considered, but I think is a factor in this, is that the sort of premium that is placed on a slab is sort of a bet on like the longevity of a company. And so like that's why I'm making the argument that I don't think SGC slabs are going to be appreciating in the near term or midterm, which is basically like there's question marks now of just like, will the SGC slabs exist in the future? And like that question alone is going to, cause some people to pause as it relates to thinking about just like, will this company be around? And therefore you're like kind of going to maybe see some counter productivity from a multiple standpoint. Whereas, like, that's what you've exactly seen with Beckett, right? I think there's some question marks of just like, what is going on with Beckett? Is that company going to be around in a few years? And you've seen, their lack of participation result in them being, perceived in the market less favorably. And so, to answer your question as it relates to Fanatics, I think if people felt comfortable that Fanatics is going to be around for the foreseeable future from a grading standpoint, I think that could help. I mean, obviously they're not going to have the pedigree, and so that's going to limit sort of like the perception of just like, are they doing it correctly, and sort of like, what does it mean for them to be grading cards? But I do think like they at least stand a chance to be, somebody that has the duration argument in their favor, and that can help with some of the perceived value of their slabs.
It also shows why they might have had an interest in SGC, just for the name value and the pedigree.
Hmm.
So, okay, FGC Becket. Are they winners in this? Is this an opportune time? Are they losers? How do you look at the two of them? How does this impact them from your perspective?
It's a fantastic question. I definitely think. Look, I think we have to look at CGC sort of as only a trading card company primarily at this stage, just because when I look at the volume, it's 93% of what they're doing month in and month out. And so I think it'd be, there's certainly an opportunity, but their strength is clearly within the TCG space. And so I think they'll continue to benefit from that standpoint. I think that people will sort of look to them as an option. SGC. Alternatively, you can make the argument though that SGC just gets better at TCG, which has been sort of their weakness at this stage, and maybe PSA part of this acquisition is to help them on maybe the lower end or the volume of volume segment of TCG. Not totally sure. So CGC is kind of a question mark, and I think it's more specific to the TCG category. Where like with Becket, you would think, and I think a lot of people could make an argument that Becket would benefit, but it's just they've been so quiet, and there's been so much change there, and sort of just a lack of transparency on sort of like what their vision is, and sort of how they sort of right the ship. And that's the company that people really want to will to sort of doing well again. And so yeah, so the short answer is like there's an opportunity. Whether or not they sort of take advantage of it is your guess is as good as mine at this stage, and it's something I think people would love to see. Personally, I would love to see it. I just think they've got such a somebody who's been in this hobby for a long time. I would love to see Beckett thrive and do well, and um, I've got a lot of Beckett slabs, and I don't want to see the company you know become devalued or whatever. I just appreciate what they do. I like subgrades, for example. Like I think that's
Yes.
interesting. So anyways, I definitely think there's an argument to be made. It's just a question mark of like, can they execute? And it's a company candidly that has been able to get out of their own way the last few years, and they're not doing themselves any favor from a communication standpoint, which is the problem. Like you can make mistakes, but you have to really get in the market and sort of like let people know what you're doing, and they're just not saying anything, which is you know just really sort of fueling this concept that they're just not caring at this stage.
You made every point I was going to make, so thank you for doing that. It saved me time.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. I do think that you have to have somebody in the company, in respect to Beckett, who's the face of the company, who's out there on a regular basis, who's
Hmm.
talking about the vision. And that's the one thing I'll give Peter Steinberg credit for. When they were growing, he was at least out there, talking about his vision, talking about what they wanted to do, and whether or not you graded with them, it gave a front facing view. Nat Turner,
Totally.
does the same thing. So I think that's Becky. You talk about just being tone deaf in messaging. Maybe they have no idea what they're doing. Maybe they're
Yeah.
sitting and they're playing darts all day. I haven't seen any change. And I grew up where a Beckett 9.5 is a great card. Beckett
Right.
10 still hold value.
Right.
I mean, that's the amazing thing. I think the whole hobby loves the Beckett name.
Yep.
So that's why I was asking that, because I agree with you. I think that it's an opportunity, but they won't get out of their own way.
It's kind of frustrating. I mean, I sit in a pretty unique position in the hobby in the sense that I'm given what I'm trying to do with the Universal Pop Report. I analyze all these companies' data all day, and so I'm looking at the different ways that they think about data, their strengths, their weaknesses, and candidly, like one of the things that I think is most exciting is that SGC's weakness was technology. Like they had to ramp up grading, they had to ramp up operations, but technology just wasn't sort of keeping pace. And it's not really their fault. They had to sort of place some bets, but there's definitely like an opportunity for them to improve. They placed the bet on an app which has worked for them, and it's a nice app, right? But there's still
Yeah.
other components of what they're doing that need improvement. And one of the strengths for PSA slash collectors has really been on data and technology the last few years. So I'm really excited about that. And I'm excited to see sort of if that's one of the sort of behind the seen benefits of this transaction over the next 12 months. It benefits me personally from what I'm building and sort of like what I want to bring to market. But in general, it'll just benefit the collector in a lot of ways that they won't necessarily like see immediately, or maybe they won't even notice, for quite some time. But that's like a significant challenge for them, and I'm excited for them to take advantage of that. The reason I bring that up though is Beckett has such good data. It doesn't ever sort of like show in the market, but like I look at their data all day and I'm like, man, they really have done a good job. It's just they've not doing themselves any favors and sort of making use of it at this stage. And so, I do believe like Beckett still has an opportunity. And that's actually one of the reasons look, you may even hear, collectors and SGC tout Beckett's position because they want to make sure Beckett looks viable as they think about like, market participation at this stage. And that's one of their strengths. And, they definitely have a lot of assets. They just need to sort of get alignment. I think that's one of the challenges you have when you have a company that clearly has like a lot of different agendas like Beckett has had. I mean, if you went to their website, you could see there was just so many different agendas that were in conflict. And, if they can get some alignment, I do think they stand a chance to benefit from this transaction. But, that's a lot easier said than done. It's not something that we've seen a lot of over the last few years.
I completely agree. And I can't remember the last time Beckett came out and made a statement about their company.
It was a year ago, and
it was when they made
when
they sold and Chopra left. I mean, that was the last time, and that wasn't a card.
Yeah.
When was the last time we had a card related announcement? When was the last time?
It was the grading scale. It was the grading scale, and that obviously they never ended up going forward with it, which is probably the right move. But it was. That was their sort of big play, and it just was one of those things that was not very well received, and whatever. I mean, there's probably a lot of things they would do over if they could.
So here we are. PSA has bought, or Collectors has bought SGC. CGC is growing, I think, more than people realize, and Beckett, I think more people are rooting for, and that's kind of the landscape right now. Is that where we are?
I think so. I think I don't know that we'll see anything major happen as it relates to this transaction for a little while. I do think like the things I'm sort of behind the scenes we'll start to sort of see, but they won't really surface from a collector standpoint, which is these technology sort of improvements. So I mean, I think there's opportunity in the near term. I think if you're sort of the CGCs and the Beckets of the world, you can sort of, if you wanted to be aggressive with marketing and you had the funds to do it, this is the time to sort of step in there and just sort of step up and sort of, offer up being sort of an alternative, which I think people want in this space. It's a very tribal. Grading in particular is pretty tribal, and I think like there's an opportunity to sort of like, people that might be on the fence or sort of looking for a home base. This is a good opportunity. It's just not, SGC again. Why this is so surprising is SGC was just doing so well on a lot of fronts, especially from like a volume standpoint. And so this was again caught me off guard, but I'm excited. I love sort of the, I think of cards in general as sort of like thoughtful chaos in a lot of ways. Like, we kind of all enjoy that it's just like this unstructured world that we're operating in, and there's a lot of opportunity in that. And this was one of those sort of like chaos moments that I don't think a lot of us were anticipating, but interesting to watch. And I am excited to see sort of how it plays out. And, it's kudos to SGC for taking advantage of what was a bit of a market shakeup. And, PSA went kind of quiet for a little while and had to do a lot of, reconfiguring. And SGC was definitely like a beneficiary of that.
Well, Ryan, your perspective is always fantastic. I went over the time, but you and I, as I always say, could do 2 hours easily. But I want to thank you for being on. As this continues to evolve, I'm certainly going to ask you back again. This is, as far as the hobby is concerned, as big of a story as we've had in a long time.
Yeah, no, this is exciting. Thank you for having me on. Thanks for giving me a few minutes just to sort of weigh in on it. Everybody's sort of got an opinion, but we're all sort of just bystanders at this stage. So, but it's definitely exciting. So thanks for having me on. I appreciate it, Dan.
Thank you, everybody. Make sure you follow GEMRATE. And all that data is also available on Hobby News Daily every day. So we appreciate that and appreciate partnering with you. So Ryan, thank you very much.
All right. Thanks again, Dan.
Take care. Everybody else, see you next time.